F1 is one of the most dangerous sports on the planet. Unlike football or tennis, mistakes don't lead to pulled hamstrings or rolled ankles. Traveling at such high speeds means that death, destruction, and serious injuries are only seconds away. But what are some of the strangest injuries F1 drivers have had on the track? And which prominent F1 figure needed a glass eye installed after an accident? Stick around to find out. First up, we have Justin Wilson's Put Your Hands Up. F1 drivers train their neck and shoulder muscles to be strong enough to withstand the massive physical stress of racing F1 cars. But even with all this training, they still need supporting equipment. At the 2003 Malaysian Grand Prix, Minardi driver Justin Wilson found out just how badly they needed support. He suffered from paralysis in both his arms and had to retire from the race on lap 41. He was in so much pain that the mechanics took 10 minutes to get him out of the car. What happened was that he was the victim of a faulty HANS device. A HANS device, which stands for head and neck support, is the big brace you can see strapped to the backs of drivers' helmets before and after they get out of an F1 car. At the time, the device had just been introduced into Formula 1. The problem at the Malaysian Grand Prix was that Justin Wilson's HANS device had become disconnected from the seatbelt. This meant that he was thrown around the cockpit during the race with incredibly high G-force. The straps on the device were also pinching his shoulders, which was causing temporary paralysis. Wilson was rushed to the hospital and had to receive pain-killing injections to reduce the pain. Remarkably though, Justin made a full recovery and was able to participate in the very next race in Brazil. Next, Mika Hakkinen, eyes taped shut. What is it about F1 drivers and not giving up? Somehow near-death experiences don't seem to discourage them. In fact, they often make them even better drivers. The next man on our list proves this. During a qualifying session at the 1995 Australian Grand Prix, a tire failure caused Mika Hakkinen to crash into the barriers at an estimated speed of 190 kilometers per hour. The Finnish driver suffered a fractured skull and inner ear damage. The impact was so heavy that buttons from the steering wheel were found in his helmet from when his head hit the steering wheel. Luckily, 2 doctors were at the corner where Hakkinen crashed and quickly performed some life-saving surgery. He was then left to recover in a hospital in Adelaide. Because of nerve damage, nurses needed to tape his eyes shut so that he could sleep. A month later, he was able to return to his home in London. Then, after a strong recovery, Hakkinen returned to F1 the following year in 1996. Not only did he bounce back, but he had his most successful years after the crash. He won 2 world championships in 1998 and 1999 at a time when Schumacher was dominating the sport. Talk about a comeback. Now we have Martin Brundle, danger afoot. When F1 drivers crash, the first concern is normally for their head and chest, but little thought is given to the limbs that do most of the heavy pushing. Drivers' feet are tucked away deep in the narrow tunnel of the cockpit and are sometimes protected from a crash. But during a practice session at the 1984 Dallas Grand Prix, Martin Brundle almost lost his feet when one of his tires was punctured and he slammed into concrete walls of a chicane, landing upside down. The impact broke both his feet and ankles. Initially, doctors wanted to amputate one of his feet, but once he was transported back to London, he recovered enough to compete in the following season. Brundle returned to F1 the next year and continued his motorsport career before retiring in 1996 with 9 podiums and 98 career points. He now exists in the sport as an iconic commentator and F1 personality. If it had not been for the British doctors, Martin Brundle may be doing his famous grid walk with a prosthetic. Don't go anywhere. Coming up, you'll learn about how one F1 legend lost his eye. Also, how did a 700-gram spring almost kill a driver? Stay tuned to find out. Up next, Juan Fangio, Sleepless in Lyon. Driving is a tiring business. How many hours can you drive on a road trip before you ask to switch drivers? There's nothing better than relaxing as a passenger when you're too exhausted to drive. But F1 drivers can feel like they are different from the rest of us. In 1950, the reigning world champion, Juan Fangio, was due to compete in a race at Monza for Maserati. The only problem was he missed his flight there and was stuck in Lyon in France. This was a 6-hour drive away, but that wasn't going to stop Fangio. He was a world-class driver and had competed in the harshest conditions imaginable. In the morning of the race, he made the long drive through the French Alps and only arrived at the racetrack half an hour before the race was due to start. The result was tragic, but unsurprising. On the second lap of the race, the Argentine lost control of his car and flipped into some trees. As far as injuries go, he was lucky to get off with just a broken neck. It could have easily been much worse. Thankfully, he fully recovered and was back to racing by the following year. Even an F1 world champion needs their 40 winks, so make sure you're well rested before taking any long drives. Now we have Clay Regazzoni, rolling with the punches. What would you do if you were confined to a wheelchair? How active do you think it would make you? For F1 driver Clay Regazzoni, it changed his life's purpose. Regazzoni was a Swiss racing driver who had some success during the 1970s. He drove for legendary teams like Ferrari, BRM, and Williams. However, his racing career was cut short when he crashed during the 1980 United States Grand Prix West in Long Beach, California. The brake pedal of the Ensign N180 car he was driving failed while traveling at around 280 kilometers an hour and slammed into a parked car. Regazzoni survived, but his injuries were some of the worst that a racing driver can get. He was left totally paralyzed from the waist down and forced to live in a wheelchair. But this didn't slow him down in life. Regazzoni dedicated his life to being an activist for disabled people and even managed to get back behind the wheel of a modified sports car to race competitively. Because he couldn't use his feet or legs, the car was entirely controlled by his hands. His injuries led Regazzoni to be an advocate for disabled rights and a great example of how physical impairment shouldn't get in the way of anything. Next is Helmut Marko, an eyesore. The next injury on the list is from Helmut Marko, who is one of the masterminds behind the Red Bull team. If you follow F1, you've probably heard about him from time to time, and if you've seen photos or videos of him, you might have also wondered, why does he have a glass eye? It has nothing to do with disease or illness, but it was instead a motor racing accident. When the French Grand Prix was still held at Clermont-Ferrand between 1965 and 1972, it was a notoriously dangerous track. Beneath a volcano and deep in the mountains, the local roads that were used for the circuit were covered in volcanic debris and stones. Unfortunately for Marko, when he competed in the last race there in 1972, these elements would leave him with a lifelong injury and end his F1 career. While driving behind Emerson Fittipaldi, the wheel of Fittipaldi's car threw a stone backwards up towards Marko's face. The stone punched a hole straight through his helmet visor and gave him permanent eye damage. This is what ended Helmut Marko's career before it really began. Altogether, he raced in only 9 races, but he has certainly made an impact on Formula One since then. He is in charge of Red Bull's driver development program and is largely responsible for bringing us young world champions like Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen. So, an eye for an eye, or an eye for 5 world championships. Lastly, Felipe Massa, 700 grams of pain. This next one was described as a freak accident and is one of those things nobody could have planned for. It also shows just how fast F1 cars are traveling. During a Hungary Grand Prix qualifying session in 2009, a spring had fallen off Ruben Barrichello's car and landed on the racing line. When Ferrari driver Felipe Massa drove over the spring, the wind caused it to fly up straight into his helmet. Although the spring only weighed 700 grams, the speed of the Ferrari was enough to knock him unconscious and cause him to crash into a tire barrier. As a result of the crash, Massa had a titanium plate inserted into his skull. This is why marshals are so eager to clean loose debris off of the track. Even a tiny piece of metal can have devastating effects. Lucky for Massa, he was able to keep racing, but I'm sure he kept an extra close eye on the track since then. There you have it, some of the strangest F1 driver injuries of all time. F1 is much safer now, but we can still look back at many bizarre moments in the sport's history. Which injury did you find most shocking? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more.